Well, hey, everybody. Thanks for joining us for our third installment of the Autistic Perspective series. We appreciate you making space to be part of this discussion with us. I'm T. My pronouns are they, them. I'm the executive director and founder of the Autism Support and Advocacy Center, and I'm going to facilitate today. Today, we're going to dive into the convergence of autism and gender identity. We have four really amazing panelists with us. In a few moments, I'll put the link to their bios in the chat in case you haven't had a chance to look at them already. We do want to name that the full spectrums of both gender and autism are not present across the panel. We understand the critical importance of representation, and while no panel could represent all the unique ways humans exist, we do acknowledge specifically that trans feminine and non-speaking perspectives are missing today. We do hope this conversation provides you the opportunity to reflect on and push the narratives you may hold around autism and gender identity, and that you can carry new understandings forward in your work, with your families, and with yourselves. Please keep in mind the level of vulnerability that it will require our panelists to discuss these intersecting identities. So please hold space for that tenderness in the conversation. This is being recorded, and we'll make sure that anyone who registered will get a link to it. We consider this a primary resource for the community, so please share it as you wish. The recordings will have closed captions added. We're in the process of raising more funds to increase accessibility, including live closed captioning, ASL interpretation, and live Spanish translation. You can always contribute towards this on the donation page on our website. These donations also go towards the compensation of our panelists. If you are from DPS, I'm adding a link right now in the chat so that you can sign in. Do that right now. And that'll always be there for the remainder. And if you're an LCSW or an MSW, a certificate of attendance will be attached in the follow-up email if you want to have this count for contact hours. Okay, so there's definitely a lot of content in this subject. Our team has zoomed in on 5 questions to get it going today. We gave these questions to the panelists a few days in advance, so they've had a chance to kind of sit with them and prepare. When we're finished with these questions, we'll open it up to questions that you may have from the audience. You can submit your questions in the chat, or you can use the feature in Zoom to raise your hand and we will we'll call on you. Throughout the conversation, we'll welcome any pauses that may occur. We encourage an active chat room, but please remain on mute if you are not speaking. Okay, so with all of that, let's jump in with the first question. So panelists, statistically, if you are autistic, you're more likely to be transgender or non-binary than an allistic person. Why do you think that this is the case?
I can go first. One thing I've noticed in my own experience is that I never really saw the point of gender when I was younger. And I grew up watching a lot of Star Trek because my dad likes Star Trek, so now I'm a Trekkie too. And I also didn't realize until I was an adult that I wasn't picking up on different social interactions and how people were socialized. It never really made a lot of sense to me. I was always called a tomboy growing up. So I think for me it's related to just not having that awareness of how allistic people interact socially, and also not really seeing a point in things that were gendered. If I'm wearing a shirt, it's so I can have cover clothing over my body. It could be a way to express myself with different colors, but I never really saw why it was gendered in any way. So that's been my own personal experience.
I really relate to what you just said about not understanding I mean, what's the point of gender? That feels like a big part of this question and answer for me too. And having to learn just having to actively learn social cues and social norms means that I didn't learn those about gender in the same way either. So it's like, I don't know, it makes sense to me.
Yeah, I've always thought that this is at least partially connected to autistic people being both less attached to social expectations around gender norms and more willing to explore and be curious about gender variance. I think for me, like when I already felt that I didn't fit in as a neurotypical girl, it didn't feel like that much of a stretch for me to explore identities other than girl. I feel like autistic people are like really intuitive about ourselves due to being a neuro minority and living with that constant sense of being like square pegs in round holes. So I feel like it's like this sort of like spidey sense we have, like, oh, I don't fit in. I'm like not this, I'm not that. And I think a lot of us are kind of hyper vigilant to the fact that we're wired differently from the majority. And so because of that, I think it might be easier for autistic people to notice that we're different in other areas too, such as gender, and be more open to exploring that since we already don't fit in other ways.
I agree with everybody. Specifically, to expand on it, there's kind of a autistic experience that I think a lot of people have where you end up questioning yourself a lot because you're not catching the social cues that everybody else is. So you just kind of you introspect a lot more about like who you are and what is going different than everybody else and why you aren't clicking the same way that everybody else seems to be. And I think with that deep introspection, there tends to be a lot more autistic people who catch that they may not be the gender that other people are telling them they are, especially when people are telling them that they're doing something in a way that is wrong when they know that they're doing something right for themselves. So there's a lot less of, because of the societal norms not really matching, just there is still the pressure, but there isn't the way to actually fit. You know, like there's no way to like know how to fit, so we end up figuring it out ourselves, and a lot of us tend to find out that we're trans. Also, a lot of representation in media when it comes to autistically coded characters, not necessarily autistically talked about characters in the narrative, they tend to be gender nonconforming. Like there's a lot of robots or aliens that don't exactly fit in the human conceptualization of gender, and a lot of us identify with these other autistically coded characters and we see ourselves in them, and then we're like, oh, does that, what that creature is being called, that sounds like the way that I want to be called. And it's different from the way that in the United States specifically gender is taught.
Thank you all. That definitely resonated with me. And it also made me think about as a person who both learned of their autistic identity and their trans identity later in life, like I am still like reflecting on how those two things intersect, but also I have a curiosity around if that if sort of the black and white thinking that can sometimes go with be an autistic trait, if that, as I was applying it to gender, made it really contributed to maybe some rigidity that I had in sort of understanding what my options were when when there wasn't representation for me to learn from. So like the lack of representation, I think for an autistic person too can also can be additionally challenging. I don't know, I'm still like processing it. For the next question, in what ways does your autistic identity and your gender identity overlap or intersect? Another way you could think about this question would be like, how does this sort of show up in your mind, in your heart, and in your body? Yeah.
I feel like for me, both my autism and my gender exist under like my personal umbrella of being queer. Like my autistic identity feels like queerness in similar ways that my gender is also queer. And I think about like the history behind the term queer, which was used to refer to things that were like odd or strange, or to be like outside the norm, like something that's different. And I kind of resonate with this idea of my neurological wiring being queered in kind of a way that my gender is too. And I love being queer. I love that my brain is queer. I love that my gender is queer. And I kind of relate to this feeling of like, there are people in the world that would see me as kind of odd or different or strange, like both because I'm autistic and because I'm non-binary. And I feel like there's so much beauty in this like so-called oddness and strangeness that like doesn't exist within the bounds of like dominant society, which is why I feel really attached to the word queer. And my heart also kind of resonates with the autistic pride and autistic rights movements in like the same ways that my heart resonates with queer pride. And my participation in both of those movements is bound up in my belief that I like don't need permission to be. I already am. And I feel like homophobia, transphobia, ableism, they're all kind of wrapped up in society's obsession with rejecting people that they see as other, which I feel largely stems from the fact that so many people have yet to learn to love themselves and their own strangeness and oddness, and then they project that self-hatred outward. So the ways that my gender identity and autistic identity overlap are connected to the fact that both are rejected by dominant social norms. And so my acceptance of my whole self requires embracing both of those at the same time. Like I can't have one without the other. They're all kind of my gender queerness, my autistic queerness. It's like all part of the same kaleidoscope for me. And they kind of both fall hand in hand with like loving and accepting myself.
I have a really, honestly, I was diagnosed just before becoming an adult, which makes it a lot harder to be diagnosed as autistic when you're an adult. And after I got diagnosed, I let myself be myself a lot more. And that includes being trans. And I was in a place where that wasn't exactly the best, but I was able to come out to my family after I left. And honestly, the intensity that me being autistic and stopping myself from masking after learning that I was autistic, and me just being able to live my own gender identity is so integral to myself and the story of my life now, that I can't think of a way that like it isn't, they aren't completely the same kind of thing, because the masking itself, I was masking my own gender identity because I was trying to fit in so much. Sorry, I'm getting kind of emotional.
Yeah, I relate to that. I feel like for the majority of my life at this point, at least for like 27 years, I was masking my gender and my neurotype, just like trying to fit in with everyone, trying to fit in, trying to be a cishet white woman, basically, neurotypical, all the things that I don't actually identify with. And yeah, I guess it is hard to pick them apart for me too, to like even think of how do they not overlap. I feel like there's definitely trauma that comes in this overlap too, like ableism and misogyny. And along with that, the complications of misogyny for a person who doesn't identify as a woman, all of those different layers have definitely contributed to trauma for me. And I think a lot of people, I mean, I see everyone nodding their heads too.
And I notice for me, like with my different identities, like not just with autism and gender, but I notice when like either I'm by myself or when I'm with loved ones and it's safe to be myself, like I just feel like I'm just kind of existing. And it's not until I go out into the world and experience different types of oppression that's been named by everyone that's when I'm like, oh, okay, like being othered in different ways. But I do pretty much see like all of my identities like being integrated in some shape or form.
Yeah, I feel that just kind of existing. And it's difficult because it's like society wants you to label yourself so that you can fit into a specific box. And it's really difficult to fit yourself into a box as an autistic. And I think everybody on this panel is non-binary as well. And that in itself comes in so many different forms. It's not its own box. In itself, it's kind of trying to be like, I don't fit into the boxes that were given to me. And at the same time, trying to find where you fit. And that's kind of the autistic experience in itself as well. Like, I don't fit into the box that society gave me. Where do I fit?
Yeah, that's pretty much how I chose the label genderqueer. I was like, this is the closest to how I identify, but nothing really fits.
Y'all are really speaking to my heart, and like that was kind of like for me a little intense to to witness. Thank you for sharing all of that. The next question is kind of talks more about the gendered boxes that are existing in society and the pressures that come with that. So because there are social and societal pressures to fit into specific gendered boxes, such as clothing, mannerisms, voice, tone, I guess, could you speak directly to how those types of things show up for you, how those pressures affect your life?
It's been interesting for me to see how this has changed with COVID and like not being in public spaces very much. Because obviously those pressures are still there. But if I don't interact with people if I'm not like in a setting where those pressures are going to be put on me in a more direct way, then I can continue to forget that they're there. Which is where I think we all talked about this in the first question too, of like, does gender even make sense? Like, and we have to like think about what these boxes even are, because we don't necessarily, as autistic people, just pick up on what the expectations are of us within a specific gendered assumption, I guess. So at this point in my life, including COVID within that, obviously, I feel less affected by these boxes than ever before, because I'm surrounded by people who get it and am able to just wear what's comfortable instead of what fits into any specific gendered box or just expectation in general.
For me, I think this question's more, I mean, gender is included. I think it's more so related to being autistic, specifically with like sensory integration and sensory overload. Like I remember like when I was little, like my mom trying to fight with me like to wear certain clothes. I'm like, no, I don't like the way it feels. Or she'd have to like cut the tags out of different clothes, or like, oh, I can't stand corduroy. Like that just, I cannot stand that texture. And for whatever reason, mid 90s corduroy pants were in style. Um, so different things like that would show up. And then um figuring out, okay, like what's how can I dress for comfort? Like how can I wear textures that are okay for me? Um, and then I never understood when I was younger, like why I was called a tomboy. But then when I hit high school, being a tomboy, like suddenly wasn't okay anymore. So like things like that would confuse me. Like I think I had already figured out my gender early on. I just didn't have the words for it. And in terms of like voice and tone, like I have a auditory processing issue. And then also being autistic, like I have a hard, at least how it shows up for me, I have a hard time controlling like my volume and my tone in different situations, like especially if I'm anxious or stressed, or if I've been nonverbal for a while and then I go to speak, it's like all of a sudden I'm like super loud and I don't mean to be. Um, and mannerisms, I guess, again, like going back to social norms, like I remember like wanting to be just like my dad, and I would like mimic him a lot. And I remember other people speaking down to me, like saying like, oh, why are you man spreading? Or like girls aren't supposed to pose with their fists under their chin. But like I would just mimic my dad a lot, but I never really understood why that wasn't okay for people.
It's very similar interaction, except I have two older brothers. And honestly, when we played growing up, like they'd put me in like boxing gloves and they were like a tutu because we had stuff around and like we'd play. So for me, it wasn't like this is girl stuff, this is boy stuff. It's like this is stuff to play with because I'm autistic, and to me, clothes are just clothes and objects are just objects. Not even when it goes onto another human body, they're just what they are. And so when it comes to like learning how to do the things that society wants you to do, like you mentioned, like there's a point like in high school where being a tomboy is not okay anymore, and it's just I can remember like kind of concocting this persona for myself, wearing extremely hyper feminine clothes because I knew that that's what I was supposed to do. Like I didn't do it well because I was very goth, and then I did like J fashion because I knew that I was weird and different, and I still wanted to like be different, but I was trying still to fit into that box that I was given, where it was just like, yep, you got to wear skirts, you got to wear um, high heels to school for some reason, because that's what everybody else was doing, and it was just like, okay, I want to fit in, I want to make friends with people, so I need to fit somewhere. I need to find a place where I fit, and I was trying to make this little like box for myself until it just wasn't working anymore. It was a costume. That's what masking kind of is. It's a costume that we make to just move through the day and not be seen and othered by neurotypical people and like just society in general.
Yeah, I grew up in a community that really enforced pretty hyper extreme gender roles, and that kind of definitely translated into how you dress, how you speak, how you interact with people of different genders or whatever. So I feel like it's in my adulthood, it's been kind of this long process of figuring out like what actually is comfortable for me and what feels good to me and what who am I outside of those pressures and those norms that I was raised to conform to. And I definitely resonate with what Michelle was saying about how the pandemic has opened up a lot more space for that. Like I definitely feel that. I feel like my wardrobe has like changed drastically because I've shifted more towards just being comfortable. I do feel like these gendered pressures show up most for me at work. And specifically, so I work in community mental health, and I feel like I kind of, when I'm in the community, when I'm with a family, and I mask my gender identity all the time because I feel very anxious about how my rapport will be affected with them if they know that I'm trans, if they know that I'm non-binary. I can't really hide the fact that I do look pretty queer. I have a pretty gay haircut. So that's like visible, but I feel this like compulsion to still seem like a cis woman, like maybe just a lesbian. So I feel like I do kind of censor myself a lot and really consider the things like clothes, mannerism, voice tone, all of that. So that's kind of always on the back of my mind in my work. But I have felt really grateful for the ways in which I've been able to develop community where I can just exist as I am, you know, with my clothes, with my voice, like Caitlin was saying, whatever my tone is sounding like, the loudness or softness or being nonverbal, whatever. So it sometimes can feel like a really stark contrast going between like my safe spaces with my community and then like where I feel like I'm putting on this act of gender so that I don't face like discrimination and stuff like that.
Yeah, one thing that I've noticed is that I was fortunate enough to be able to find a job where I could be myself before or like during the pandemic. And it did help being at home because I had a job where there was a lot of trans antagonism, a lot of racism that I had to deal with coworkers. And I was like, I can't take this anymore. It's taking a toll on my mental health. And I was out at work, so I was targeted a lot more. Um, and then the new job I got, it was okay for me to be genderqueer. It was okay for me to use they, them pronouns, but it wasn't okay to be Black. There was a lot of racism there. So I was like, okay, where it's probably like a unicorn place, but what space can I create for myself? So now I'm a contractor and I work at a private practice, but I'm essentially my own boss. And so because of my profession and the license that I have, I've been able to do that. And I just try to find other spaces where I can be myself and like my identities are celebrated and served at those places too. So it does make a huge difference if it's safe to be out at work or not, or figuring out like how you can navigate oppression in different ways. Because it, in a lot of states, it is still legal to fire people because of gender identity or sexuality. Um, and so it is a serious thing that people have to figure out how to navigate.
We talked about like the wider society quite a bit, and I'm wondering, how do you guys feel about talking about like LGBTQ spaces and their social norms, because they're different social norms from the wider social norms? I think that like it would be interesting to hear from everybody.
I think because of the pandemic, like I was really craving those spaces. I also moved during a pandemic too. Um, so I think the first thing I went to, like once I felt safe enough, Phoenix, Arizona had their Pride, I think last October or November. It was sometime in the fall. And I just felt like really safe there. It was a lot of fun. Like I could be there with my family and not worry about like, is someone going to say something to us? Is someone going to do something? But it was just a lot of fun to celebrate ourselves and like do different activities with my family at Pride. So I think that's like one of the first things I got to do, like since my family got to be vaccinated and like being out and about.
I think that some of the pressures like within the overall queer community, at least in the past, have related to me feeling like not trans enough or something, like not actually non-binary. I mean, I like do my nails and like just do a lot of things that fit with feminine, I guess. I feel complicated about that word, but feminine things. And I'm also still not a woman. And so that has been a thing that has come up within that community. I think also related to being autistic within that as well. It's like, I don't necessarily consider or think about the ways that I may be perceived. I mean, I do to a large extent for really related to my gender and autism, but in that specific community, like I went to a queer health fair recently in Durham, North Carolina, and I feel like I didn't have to think about either of those things at all, which was really cool. So it's kind of like, for me, it goes both ways with different pressures that then make me question whether is this actually a space that I fit in or not. And also just being able to find spaces where I don't have to even consider that has really been helpful.
I feel like sometimes the queer community has fallen into a trap of creating boxes kind of within the community. Like, I feel like overall the queer community wants to be different from the rest of society, in the sense of like, oh, we don't force people to fit into boxes. Oh, it's okay to be different here. But then kind of when you're in it, there can be this experience of like, oh, you're actually kind of doing the same thing, but it's just like different in different ways. So like it can be hard to be non-binary because you're not, you know, one or the other. And I feel like there are similar kind of boxes that can be created in terms of like neurodivergence and being autistic. Like there have been spaces where I'm like, oh, I'm comfortable here as a non-binary queer person, but I don't feel comfortable here as an autistic person. So I feel like for me, the challenge has been, like a lot of you were saying, is to like find spaces where I can be all of those things. And a lot of that time, a lot of those spaces for me have ended up just being like other autistic trans people or other neurodivergent queers. So yeah, it's been kind of complicated, I would say.
Yeah, and because of those reasons, I think at least I'm still exploring what's in Phoenix, but I kind of put myself into a bubble for safety. And so I haven't had to experience a lot of the different things that y'all have named of like things being separate. Because I would be in Durham a lot in North Carolina. So I would go to things that were specifically for either queer people of color or Black femmes or Black trans women, because that's where I felt the safest. But before I started finding events like that to go to our community to be a part of, I did have a lot of times of feeling like I had to choose between being Black or being gay, but there was rarely like spaces that had different intersections with them.
Thank you all. Yeah, listening is making me think about, you know, I get in the rhythm of not thinking about it as much, but sitting here and like naming all of the things, just thinking about how many spoons we spend just to be somewhere as ourselves. And knowing that in the context of all the other things that we're like supposed to be doing every day. Yeah, it feels like so much to hold. Yeah. Thanks for naming all of those things. Our next question is directly speaking about how masking applies to gender identity and autism for you. I know that we have talked about masking throughout many of the other questions, but I want to open it up to see if there were any other things that you wanted to contribute towards that specifically.
Because unmasking for me is a uphill battle, it's an ongoing process, especially as I go through my transition. I kind of find myself ping-ponging between gender norms to try and fit in, and or like remasking myself into more like a masculine box, because it's like, well, that's the way that I'm going. I need to keep like making my voice deeper, or when I get excited and stim, I need to stim this way, or my voice can't get up this high anymore because I'm so excited. I'm like focused sometimes in certain spaces, not with people that I care about or on my own. That I need to be moving in a very particular way, like the way that I walk. I think about that when I'm out just in public in general, as partly just like a safety thing, because it's still kind of dangerous in a lot of places to be just outwardly queer or moving in a way that you're not supposed to if you look a certain way.
I want to talk a little bit about my experiences with masking as an autistic person within my professional field. So I work with folks who have intellectual and developmental disabilities who also have mental health conditions. So I work with a lot of autistic people, a lot of families who support autistic individuals. And I kind of came into this field when I was fresh out of grad school with, I think, some optimism that maybe there would be space for me in this field and that my perspective as someone with lived experience would be valued. And so I kind of was excited and was like, these are my people, this is who I want to work with. And then pretty quickly realized that that field is actually really steeped in a lot of ableism. And I quickly developed this feeling like my competence as a mental health professional would be dismissed really quickly if I was open about being autistic. And I also felt that I would be invalidated and that my diagnosis would be dismissed because people would think that I don't seem like I'm autistic. And I even actually kind of hesitated to be on this panel initially because I was like, oh, there are people here that might know me and maybe don't know that I'm autistic. And I was sort of like, oh my God, like, am I comfortable kind of being out about this? Because I've spent so much energy being fearful about being invalidated and being dismissed and being infantilized and being viewed as unprofessional, and like all of those things have happened to me in the times that I have disclosed to people. So I kind of felt like for my own self-preservation, I had to keep it really quiet and only share with certain people. And it's just been extremely disheartening, honestly, to be in this field a little bit as an autistic person, because I feel like I do have a really great perspective to offer. And I feel like people could really benefit from asking, like from learning from autistic people, autistic adults, and people who have lived experience as being neurodivergent. But it's just been like causing me, honestly, like too much trauma to try and deal with all of the microaggressions while just trying to earn a paycheck. So I feel like I have this tension in me of like, I want to be open, I want to be authentic and kind of like my true self. Like, it's so exhausting to mask. It's so exhausting to put on this presentation of being neurotypical when I'm not. But my reality is that I usually still just do that because I still feel like most days I'm just kind of a delicate flower that can't handle too much trampling. And I'm just trying to make a living in this like capitalistic society. But I really would love for the people who are listening, who are, you know, in the social work field or in the counseling field or the IDD field, to kind of maybe kind of think through, like, what do you think of when you think of an autistic person, and maybe challenge yourself to consider the fact that there are autistic people who can hold the same credentials that you have, that we are capable of, you know, accomplishing what allistic people are capable of accomplishing. And just because you think somebody doesn't look like your client doesn't mean that they're not autistic.
My answer for this question really goes into the last question that I know was going to come up, so I'm just going to wait.
And that was a little bit of a mic drop, Amy. Yeah, so it was kind of hard to follow too. So I'll move into the last question, which is that historically the face of autism has been a white male. When you look at statistics going back in time, the ratio of male bodied to female bodied autistic individuals over time has tended to decrease. It's in the earlier years, it was like a 7 to 1, 9 to 1 kind of ratio. Today's research is showing a 2 to 4 to 2 to 4 to 1. So, you know, knowing that that is evolving, and knowing that even with that evolving, when you see it in media, when you see it on autism websites, like the face is almost always a young white male. How does this impact women, people raised as women, trans or gender nonconforming people, and people of color?
We mentioned a little bit earlier that representation being really important, and the fact that there isn't a lot of representation for all those people is dangerous for a lot of us. Like, it's. I mentioned really quick about like me masking to be safe, and that's because like while I am light skinned, I'm still black, and stimming in public while being black or acting not normal while being black, people will assume a lot of things about you. Especially if you're being perceived masculine while being black and acting different. There's a lot of danger that comes from that type of view, as well as like the underdiagnosis that happens for pretty much everybody who isn't a white cis man or child, because a lot of white cis boys are diagnosed a lot sooner than anybody else because they catch those signs a lot quicker because they're assumed to be further outside of the norm, like whereas like young girls are told to not like things like that, or have the pressure, societal pressure of being taught to be quieter, which in itself is an autistic trait. If you go nonverbal, being quiet isn't seen as a detriment for a person who's socialized female. It is for a young boy because it's abnormal. Stuff like that. And with that underdiagnosis comes with a lot of misdiagnoses, issues with medications, where I've learned that my brain doesn't take most medications well, but that's not really talked about where it comes to like a diagnosis with autism, and the fact that a lot of medications aren't made for our brain chemistry, but we're still like overly misdiagnosed instead of just given the autism diagnosis because of the stigma.
Yeah, I've noticed on my dad's side of the family, I have several, I think they identify as men last time I talked with him, but I have several men cousins like who have been diagnosed with autism like when they were kids. But I didn't get diagnosed until this past October. Because as a matter of fact, Michelle actually approached me about this panel before I had like any of the assessments done. I was like, I don't know, it's more like a self-diagnosis or things that my friends have noticed. I'm not sure. Um, and also it was really expensive too, like being diagnosed as an adult, like it's typically not covered by insurance. So I like had like talked with my partner about it, like, okay, is this worth it? Like, what are the pros? What are the cons? So definitely Black people going underdiagnosed. And I've noticed that with my clients too, having to do a lot of advocacy for clients. Like when I worked at a state hospital in North Carolina, like having to tell the psychologist on the team, like, can you please redo these assessments for this client? Like, this is what I think is going on. Because I do think Black cis men are more likely to be diagnosed with either like narcissistic tendencies or like sociopathic tendencies, when actually like this is what I think is going on, and like he's not going to be able to go to a group home after if he has this diagnosis or this is in his record. So having to do a lot of advocacy like for what I'm seeing. In terms of being out and about and masking, I'm not sure if it's because of my hairstyle or my clothes. I've noticed a lot of white people tend to assume that I'm a Black male. So I'm not sure if they like view me as a Black teenager or a Black man. Like it really, because of racism, doesn't matter. Like we don't have humanity a lot of times in the eyes of other people. So I'll be quiet out of safety because I'm like, oh, if I speak and they hear I have a higher pitched voice, or they know that I'm not cis, like what else is going to happen besides what's already happening because they think I'm a Black boy or I'm a Black man. And it'll be like just doing like just I think the last time this happened, I was just going to the Chipotle in my neighborhood. And this was during, when was this? This was like around the time that like Omicron had gone up a lot, and Chipotle still has signs up like, please wear a mask. I'm in Arizona, it's a free for all. But I still wear a mask. And there was 4 police officers. They were all white men. They were at least 6 feet tall because I'm 5'10". So I knew they at least had like a couple inches on me, and none of them were wearing masks. Every time I've seen a first responder out here, they're not wearing a mask, including EMT workers. So they're in front of me about to go into the Chipotle. So I just try to wait for them to pass. And then they stop and hold the door for me. I'm like, oh, I have to walk between these like police officers are working with the public without masks on. I don't want to. So I just stopped and looked at them, like hoping they would walk in, but I didn't want to say anything. So then one of them points at me and like, you go ahead. Like, that's how he said it. And so I'm like, okay, like I'm just, and I know they don't like, my neighborhood's mostly Black. I know they don't live here. So I go in, and then one of them behind me says, thank you, really sarcastically, because I didn't say anything. And another one of them said, well, like, well, it figures. Like, and I can't do anything or say anything because they're police officers. I'm at a Chipotle. I'm just trying to get a burrito and then go back home. And then it was just like all this tension for no reason in my mind. Um, so I think sometimes I mask in a way that like whatever someone's assuming about me, I just stay quiet and don't correct them. Like I just wait for the moment to pass out of safety, hoping that the moment passes. But other things I've been concerned about and seen in the news, like if someone's Black and nonverbal and they're not able to follow a police officer's directions, or it seems like they're not listening or they're resisting whatever the police officer is trying to do, that's a very dangerous thing. There was actually, fortunately, he lived, but it wasn't the boy who was autistic, but his aide was shot by police because he was trying to get the boy he was working with. And he was a Black man who got shot. I think they were both Black. But thankfully he survived, but like it shouldn't even be like that or he'd have to worry about it. And so I worry my cousins who do have autism, especially the ones who are nonverbal, I worry about their safety a lot when they're out and about.
Well, I feel like this question applies to like what everything that y'all have been saying, like all these huge societal issues. And another way that I had been thinking about the question was like, I never thought of myself as potentially or possibly being autistic because of only seeing white male autistic representation. So I'm like, this can't possibly be what I am. And also I've had many people who are close to me or in my circles anyway, been like, oh, you can't possibly be autistic. There's no way that you're autistic. Just based on their own stereotypes about what autism is, and because of masking, because of my masking that I've done as well for safety in different situations, and just to try to not be noticed, I guess, all of that too. I feel like masking has contributed, or I guess because the face of autism has been a white male, that has contributed to the need for masking as well.
Yeah, I completely agree with all of that. I wrote some notes for this question beforehand and had this whole blurb about how the Black and brown kids that I work with are much more likely to be given diagnosis of like oppositional defiant disorder or conduct disorder, like all of those things that Caitlin was saying. And then put on like mood stabilizers and antipsychotics that don't work well with their nervous system and their brain wiring, and then just kind of make things worse. So just want to like, yes, like I'm seeing all of that in my work, and I think probably a lot of the folks on the call are seeing that too, and would really benefit from being mindful of, you know, the impact of racism on diagnostic screening and the ways in which we're more likely to assign negative behavior-based diagnoses to Black and brown kids, as opposed to understanding that there might be an underlying neurodivergence or or a trauma history to consider. And then to kind of reflect on what Michelle was saying, like I completely agree that the fact that the face of autism has always been a white male, I think sets up like everyone on this panel here for being more invalidated, unrecognized, dismissed, overlooked. Like we have to justify ourselves all the time. Like it's just kind of layer upon layer
Yeah, one thing I've noticed is like my partner was telling me about this article with TikTok and like more cis girls being reported for having tics. I'm like, well, what if it's just another gender thing? Because tics is another thing that like it has a high overlap with autism and OCD and ADHD, and all those things are gendered when they're diagnosed. And so it's like, what if it's just another thing where like, oh, like mostly cis boys get this and they weren't diagnosed and they like, oh, like I get that too. I was like, it doesn't make sense that someone could watch a video and then develop a disorder. Like it just, if that was the case, everybody would have a lot of different disorders from watching things.
Yeah, it's a- it's really kind of disheartening when people dismiss people's own lived experience when they try and come to a doctor or even just like tell their friends like, hey, I think I have this, and they go, well, did you just watch a video about it and now you think you have? It's like, what if they did? What if they watched a video and they noticed that they had symptoms, and maybe those symptoms don't match up down the line, but like they're noticing stuff about themselves? You shouldn't be just blanket dismissing somebody who's seeing themselves finally, um, even like self-diagnosis. Technically, I self-diagnosed before I was diagnosed by my doctor because my doctor was talking to my family and didn't talk to me yet. And I was like, hey, I've literally seen this person, and everything they said was exactly the way that I feel and think. And they were like, well, we've been talking to your family for weeks. And it's like, you didn't tell me? So you're going to, a doctor's never going to understand exactly how the person's thinking and feeling in their own private time, especially if they've been masking most of their lives and they don't feel safe to be like that in front of new people. It's going to take time. It's going to take a long time for somebody to unmask in front of you as a professional. And if they do, and you get that, or they may just notice, like, hey, when I'm alone, these are the things that I do, and I don't feel comfortable doing that with other people. Is there a reason why this is? So a lot of those symptoms will probably be caught a lot quicker if you were just able to talk about it after seeing it without people constantly dismissing your own lived experience. Because if it's wrong, and it'll be caught later. But it's better to at least know what's kind of going on than to be like, well, this isn't happening at all.
Yeah, before I forget, I just remembered with the autism assessment, it's in in undergrad and grad school, like so I'm a licensed professional counselor. So in school we were taught that cis boys were more likely to be autistic than any other population. So I'm not sure if they have stopped teaching that recently, but I do know that was taught as of like 2011, 2012. And when I went for my assessment for autism, the assessments were gendered, and the psychologist I work with asked which one did I want to choose, if I want to do both assessments. So if y'all have clients that need to be tested, or if you yourself need to be assessed or want to, just be aware of that, that the assessments are still very much gendered, and you might have to figure out, okay, like, do I want to sit for both, or do I want to pick like two shorter ones? But the assessments are still gendered. Like, and what I mean by that is like there's one labeled for female and one labeled for male, and there's a different set of questions that they ask.
We could definitely keep going and going, but I want to save some time for people who are attending to ask questions. So I've got the chat open and you're welcome to put them in there. I'm also expanding my screen so that I can see everybody square, and you can raise your hand as well.
I see a question in the chat.
You do? Okay. Let's see. They're asking which assessments are gendered.
The written and the oral tests that they do for autism. So when you go to see, like, if you meet the criteria for autism, there's one specific assessment that they made for cis women, and there's one specific assessment that they made for cis men. So there's not any inclusivity with people who are gender expansive.
Martha?
Oh, sorry. Yeah. If it's okay. So that was my question. And so I was just wondering, is that more for adult assessments then? I'm used to, I did like play-based assessments earlier in my career, and so that was not the case, but those were also maybe different.
The tests that psychologists do.
Okay.
So psychologists that are trained to do testing for different disabilities or for the purpose of education or just in general, that's the test that psychologists are trained on.
Okay. All right, great. Well, I'll just keep a lookout for that for our own kiddo. I did have one more question, if it's okay. I wanted to ask, so we have a 5-year-old who I believe is possibly autistic, but also expressing a trans identity at this time. And it's been a few months, so it's still pretty early for us with that expression. But I was wondering, because my sister is non-binary, and at this stage, it feels very like specifically binary. We've done a lot of talk about like non-binary and things like that with our kid. But I wondered, were there ever times like when you were younger or things like that, or do you ever notice that that like identifying as more like trans, I guess in a binary sense, like trans female or trans male, that is part of like the understanding of like being non-binary? I'm just wondering, just from like an early perspective, and I don't know, it's maybe hard to remember when you were younger, but I know I don't remember much, but I was just curious, like if you had any perspective on like, that understanding when you were younger. Thanks.
I think maybe we spoke to this in one of the earlier questions a little bit about not having the language for non-binary or trans potentially at the time. I mean, I don't know what everyone's ages were, but I definitely didn't hear about what non-binary even was until college at some point. So for me, it was more like I just didn't. Well, really what happened for me was I was like, well, this just must be what it means to be a girl. And this must be how all girls feel all the time. Which I have learned since is not true. But yeah.
Okay, another question. Oh, go ahead, Az.
Go with that question because I was kind of gonna do both.
Okay. The next question from the group is from Annie saying, I am the parent of a trans non-binary autistic adolescent. I'm so encouraged by the openness and strength of the panelists. Do you have any thoughts on how a parent can be supportive during the turmoil of adolescence?
So it's kind of a little of both. So because the first time that I really knew what trans was high school. And let's see, sorry, my thoughts are running a mile a minute here. And I heard it from a friend who then, when I was like, that sounds like me, said no. So one, to be supportive, just if since your child seems to be open and honest with you, just like always be like, you're good, and if things change, they change, because I don't think that a lot of people have like completely static idea of who they are as people in general. Like, sure, you know that you are a woman, but what woman means to you can change over time. And same with like, so you could be non-binary, and non-binary might change what that specifically means to you and how you want to express your gender over time. And um, if your child desires like a name change, um, depending on who they are, they may desire like 5 name changes in their lives. I mean, same thing happens to cis kids. Some cis kids just don't like their name and they change it multiple times in their lives. It's kind of just, as a parent would, just being there, ready for if something else happens, just like rolling down the line. Some people stay exactly the same throughout their entire lives. They know who they are and they're ready to continue, but always allow them to know that like you're fine with them continue to search for themselves, because if they feel like because they made the decision that they're binary or that they're non-binary and that they have to stick to that because of social pressure, that they don't need to. They're allowed to explore throughout their entire lives. They don't need to figure it out by the time that they've hit 18 because they're an adult and they need to know who they are. Will always just kind of be, and the labels themselves can change because the labels are just the words that we use to express to other people how we feel. How we feel is how we feel.
I'd like to also add that, yeah, like as is saying, like things are always evolving and changing, you know, everything about who I am, I know will continue to evolve as I've watched it do it for 40 years. So as a parent, like maintaining openness with whatever is presented, however your child wants to identify, that you maintain an openness for it, and that you don't put all the labor on them to have to explain everything to you, that you do your own research, like coming to things like this. And because if your own family does not honor your pronouns or know what pronouns are or understand the context of non-binary and trans identity, if you're constantly having to do that work, like you're not feeling safe and heard in your own space, and you will be masking at home, and that's another, and at a degree to which, you know, it is exhausting. So just like maintaining that openness, doing the work, to be beside them and let them lead. Yeah.
And just as like what I've noticed in my work as a clinician, with supporting kids, is seeing if there are different ways that they can get what they need in different environments. Like I think it's pretty common for people to mask at like family dinner or family gatherings. If it's expected that they hug family members, or just like any type of physical contact. And it's really common for parents to want to physically comfort their child, but just practicing like reflecting their agency back to them and asking, is it okay if I hug you? Is it okay if I touch your hand or put my arm over your shoulders? And then seeing if they need anything at school, like added to a 504 plan or IEP. Like, do they need noise cancellation headphones at school? Do they need earplugs, earbuds to listen to music? Can they take a break whenever they need to at school? Just figuring out different ways that their day could be a little bit easier. And also, I have ADHD, so I apologize if I repeated anything too.
Well, it is 1:15. It is the end of the session. I thank you all so much. Caitlin, Rami, Michelle, thank you for all the time and labor that you put into this conversation today. Thank you for the vulnerability, your willingness to share. It is this kind of conversation that opens people, that opens understanding. It's really powerful, and just really appreciate you doing this work. Attendees, thank you for being here too, for listening. I hope that this conversation lingers with you and informs the way you think about autism, gender identity, and its intersection. DPS teachers, I am going to put your second link in the chat so you can sign out. There you go. And I especially want to just take a moment to say that I hope that those of you who needed to find community here today, that you were able to do that. Your existence is beautiful, and thank you for coming. Our next one is April 20th. We'll be discussing race, and you'll be able to sign up for that in a couple weeks. So thanks for coming. Panelists, if you want to chill for a few minutes after, that's cool. Also, you can totally peace out. Thanks, everyone.